China just did something historic because as of June 2025, it expanded its zero-tariff policy to cover 100% of taxable exports from 53 African countries, excluding only Eswatini. This isn't charity. It's a bold affirmation that Africa's nearly $300 billion trade partnership with China is reshaping the global economic order. Now, compare that to the United States, whose AGOA trade deal is conditional, politically reviewed, and used to punish countries that fall out of favor. 53 African nations didn't kneel. They negotiated and they earned access. While the West continues its moralizing lectures, China is unlocking its entire 18 trillion consumer market to the African goods. The numbers don't lie. China-Africa trade grew 8.1% in the first 4 months of 2025. Meanwhile, access to the American market via the AGOA remains a tool of political pressure, as seen with the suspension of countries who fall out of favor with Washington. This is not just trade policy. It marks the beginning of the end of 500 years of Western economic dominance. And if that weren't enough, at the 2024 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, 53 African leaders endorsed the Beijing Declaration, affirming their commitment to multilateralism and rejecting unilateral pressure and economic coercion. In simple terms, China is tearing down barriers on free trade. America is building a wall through their trade tariffs. In this episode of Frontline Africa, we unpack how African countries are embracing dignity over dependency and partnership over neocolonialism. China's trade with Africa hit $295.5 billion in 2024, growing at 6.1% year over year, while US-Africa trade was just under $64 billion in the last full year measured. That's not just statistics, that's a powerful statement from our continent. Let me break down the mathematics of liberation for you. When China announced zero-tariff access to 53 African countries in June 2025, they weren't doing us a favor. They were recognizing what we've always known. Africa is the future. Meanwhile, America's AGOA benefits can be revoked at any time for political reasons, turning trade into a weapon. While China removes barriers to African success, America's AGOA comes with strings. While China builds the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway that cuts travel time from 10 hours to 4 hours, America lectures us on democracy. While China constructs over 10,000 kilometers of railways across our continent, the West sends us aid with more conditions than a legal contract. This is the difference between partnership and neocolonialism, between respect and racism, between building up Africa and keeping Africa down. Now, let's talk about our brother Eswatini, the only African country left out of this historic wave of economic cooperation. Why, you may ask? I'll tell you. Because since 1968, Eswatini has been Taiwan's most loyal friend in Africa. And Beijing's One China policy means no diplomatic relations, no seat at Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and no access to these economic initiatives. Picture this. 53 African countries are at the biggest trade party in history, and Eswatini is standing outside, holding a Taiwan flag, clutching old diplomatic loyalties. Eswatini's 1.4 million people are watching nearly $300 billion in trade and investment opportunities pass them by because their leadership refuses to switch from Taipei to Beijing. It's almost poetic. In a continent where China has become our largest trading partner for 15 consecutive years, Eswatini remains the last holdout for a Taiwan that the rest of the world has moved on from. We respect the loyalty, but we question the economics. For 500 years, the West extracted wealth estimated at $152 trillion from the global South, with Africa bearing the largest burden through slavery, colonialism, and continued resource extraction. They turned our continent into a raw materials factory for European development while keeping us poor and dependent. Even after independence, nothing changed. Western powers and their multinational corporations continued the colonial model. We export raw materials, they export back finished products at inflated prices. The IMF and the World Bank became the new colonial governors, imposing structural adjustment programs that resulted in slower growth, increased poverty, lower incomes, and decreased healthcare across Africa. Now, let's dismantle the so-called debt trap diplomacy myth. The numbers don't lie. Nearly 75% of Africa's external debt is owed to multilateral institutions and Western private lenders, not China. In fact, only 12% is owed to China, and Beijing offers interest rates half as high as what the West offers. Academic research confirmed there is no evidence that China lends with intention to seize African assets. Even the Atlantic calls the debt trap narrative as a lie. What's really trapping Africa is the IMF and the World Bank, whose structural adjustment program enforced austerity and deepened poverty. Despite $2.6 trillion in Western aid since 1960, most of that money never touched African ground. While the West lectures Africa on governance and human rights, China builds. Chinese investment is powering 78 ports, 10,000 kilometers of railways, 100,000 kilometers of roads, and landmark infrastructure like the Ethiopian Djibouti Railway and the Lekki Deep Sea Port in Lagos. These aren't just projects. They are lifelines for African growth and sovereignty. Unlike the West, China imposes no political conditions, no lectures, no puppet strings, just partnership. This isn't about Chinese generosity. It's about Africa taking control of its future. Leaders across the continent are responding. Take, for example, Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu endorsed the Nigeria-China Comprehensive Strategic Partnership as one rooted in mutual respect. Kenya reaffirmed its support for the Forum on China and Africa Cooperation. Zambia's President Hichilema highlighted how BRICS expansion helped tackle Africa's biggest challenge. Africa is no longer waiting to be saved. It's choosing partners who respect its sovereignty and walking away from those who don't. China's zero-tariff policy is more than just trade. It's a declaration of Africa's right to choose its own partners and paths. For too long, we were told to pick between Western democracy and Chinese authoritarianism. But Africa is choosing something else: sovereignty. The 2024 Beijing Declaration, backed by 53 African nations, is proof. This isn't about choosing sides, it's about choosing respect. When African nations align with China, they are asserting the same independence that revolutionary states like the Alliance of Sahel States have boldly defended. BRICS expansion, now including Egypt and Ethiopia, amplifies Africa's voice in global decision-making. As Djibouti's president put it, BRICS is helping place Africa in the rightful position in the global order. This is about power, not charity. China and BRICS treat Africa as equals. Meanwhile, the US uses trade deals like the AGOA to punish non-compliant nations, wielding market access as economic blackmail. Africa is done begging. Now, it's bargaining. The zero-tariff policy is already delivering results, redirecting African exports towards Chinese massive barrier-free market. Unlike the West's conditional trade deals, China offers real partnership without lectures or strings. With $50.7 billion committed to infrastructure and trade corridors, China is investing in Africa's integration and development, not with aid, but with partnership. This aligns with the African Union's Agenda 2063 and supports alternatives to Western-dominated systems. Revolutionary states like the AES are leading this shift, strengthening ties with China and Russia while asserting economic independence. Through BRICS and China-Africa Forum, Africa is building new financial systems that don't rely on Western approval. The West is under pressure to change, but Africa is already moving forward. China's zero-tariff approach proves one thing: when you respect African sovereignty, you earn African partnership. To the 53 African nations embracing this shift, congratulations. To the West, Africa has new friends now. We are not going back. This is Frontline Africa. If you value truth unfiltered and power reframed from an African lens, subscribe, like, and tell us what you think in the comments. I am Ezekiel Enejeta. See you in the next one.